Hi, I'm John Groders. Today we have a story as crazy as any you'll ever hear. He was a multi-millionaire by the age of 30, had the world by the tail, until his world came tumbling down around him. And then his life story was played out on the big screen with Steven Soderbergh directing and Matt Damon playing him. Well, his name is Mark Whitacre. You're going to want to hear this on No Shame.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame. On the gospel of his name, it's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid. No shame.
Welcome to No Shame. I'm John Groders. Our guest today is Mark Whitacre. And Mark, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
Mark is coming to us from Cincinnati. We are broadcasting from the basement studios at Groders here in Holland, Michigan. And I am fascinated to jump into this conversation today, Mark. And I think the entry point for most of us to you would probably be the 2009 movie called The Informant. If you are listening to the podcast, you might remember there was a movie where usually studly superhero Matt Damon suddenly becomes a businessman turned FBI informant. And that movie, called The Informant, directed, I believe, by Steven Soderbergh, Mark, was about you. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. It's about me when I was 32 years old, which was 30 years ago.
30
That's
years
the period
ago.
of time that it was, yes.
Well, so you were played by Matt Damon. First of all, when they cast Matt Damon, were you satisfied?
Well, I felt like he was my identical twin. I think if people look at me on my website and they look up Matt Damon, actually there's pictures of me with Matt Damon on my website, they would see that he was my identical twin.
in mostly in the Bourne Identity movies, I would say, yeah.
I say that in a jokingly way.
Yeah, I would want Matt Damon, the Bourne Identity one. So The Informant, I saw the movie when it came out. Maybe our listeners may have seen it or may not have seen it. But let's just talk about the movie for a minute. If you might remember, Matt wore a pretty nasty mustache in that movie. Was that accurate?
Well, I had a mustache. It was supposed to portray the time that I was ADM from 1989 to 1996. So, 30 years ago, 1989, I had a mustache, but it was a lot thinner mustache than that. But mustaches were pretty common. I didn't know very many people that did not have one during that time.
Everyone's got a beard today. In the late 80s, early 90s, it was the mustache. I'm with you. And the other thing about the movie, and I'm going to ask you to describe it a bit, was that it was comedic in a sense. It was a comedy movie, but I don't think your life was actually a comedy. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, actually, absolutely. There's 3 books written on the case also, one called The Informant, one called Rats in the Grain, and the other one called Mark Whitacre Against All Odds. All 3 books are very serious dramas. They'd be like reading The Firm, the Tom Cruise movie, The Firm,
sure.
or the John Grisham book.
Yeah.
Very similar. I mean, you would think it was very similar to The Firm.
Right.
And Warner Brothers, or Steven Soderbergh, the director, licensed the book from New York Times, The Informant, and turned it into a comedy. But if you look at all 3 books, which I would say are documentaries on the case, they're all 3 very serious dramas.
I am sure that's interesting because the Informant, and I haven't had a chance to read the books yet. I did see the movie. It was a story about corporate espionage, and that is a John Grisham. You're right, The Firm, where the corporation starts to flex its muscles and it crosses the line. Can you give us the storyline of your life, of the movie? They're kind of the same in some ways.
Yeah, and one other thing I will add to that regarding the comedic, the FBI was so upset that it was a comedy, just for your listeners to be aware of. They did a documentary 6 months later to combat the movie.
Wow.
They did it on Discovery Channel, very high-quality documentary with the 4 real FBI agents, all now retired, had my wife and I, the prosecutor, all the real people involved 30 years ago in this documentary that came out 6 months after the movie in 2010. And that is on my website, markwhitacre.com. And it's called Undercover, but it's a high quality with the real people involved, including the 4 FBI agents.
Well,
when people watch that, they see that it's not a comedic story.
Oh, yeah. Well, and by the way, MarkWhitacre.com. Just your last name is spelled ACRE. Is that right? WHIT.
That's correct.
So Mark Whitacre.
WHITACRE.
Okay, so go to that MarkWhitacre.com as you listen to this conversation afterwards, and let's take a look at the Undercover, a more serious and probably a lot more accurate exposition of this story. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And I would say probably the comedic tone this was one of the more inaccurate, because in reality it involved someone wearing a wire for 3 years, the longest duration of anybody wear a wire in history. I wore a wire 10 hours a day for 3 years. I was wired up at 6 a.m. every morning by the FBI Monday through Friday, and wore a wire 9, 10, 11 hours a day.
Wow.
And I was told, in the documentary shows this, as I was being wired up, I was told, they'd say, Mark, if these guys catch you, they're going to kill you. This is serious stuff. This is billions of dollars at stake, people to go to prison at stake, and billionaires and multimillionaires involved. They said, something serious is going to happen if they know you're wearing a wire. And that comes out so clear in the documentary. And I don't think the movie portrayed that danger of what happened. And the FBI don't even allow an informant to wear a wire longer than a year, because they saw what happens when someone wears one for 3.
Really?
So it's changed even whistleblower laws, how long a person can wear a wire for the FBI. I mean, it changed lots of laws as a result of this very serious historical case. In the case, you asked the question kind of what it involved.
Yeah.
It actually was a price-fixing scheme, an international cartel. Like your listeners, what they have for breakfast today, lunch today, and dinner today will likely have something from ADM in that, an ingredient from Archer Daniels Midland in those foods. Like if you look at a Kellogg's breakfast cereal, or a beverage like a Coca-Cola or Pepsi or an orange juice or Pillsbury or Kraft, and you look at that ingredient label on the side of that package that they put in their grocery cart, 9 times out of 10 it has something from ADM in that food or beverage.
Wow.
And we were fixing the prices of some of those ingredients in those foods, which is illegal. I mean, the United States is built on capitalism, and by having competition, that's what creates prices that consumers can afford. But when competitors work together in a price-fixing scheme, or what's called an international cartel, they then inflate those prices. So instead of competing with a competitor, you're working with a competitor, and that then drives the prices up for the consumers, which really takes capitalism out of the equation, which is what our United States is built upon.
So you were working for
price gouging.
You were working for Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, right, at the time.
That's correct.
And what was your role in the company?
I was divisional president of the biotech division. It was the fastest growing division of the company. The company had a CEO, a vice chairman, a president, and then 4 divisional presidents. And I was ranked number 4 out of 30,000 employees. I was ranked number 4 executive in the company. And I was 32 years old at that time. The CEO was 75. The president was 69, and I was 32, the number 4 executive, reporting to them.
Wow. Man, so, and just a bit on your background, you're a scientist, right, by trade?
Yeah, well, by education, I am. I have a PhD in biochemistry from Cornell in New York, Bachelor of Mathematics from Ohio State. Your Michigan listeners probably don't like to hear that Ohio State name, and then a PhD in biochemistry from Cornell.
Okay, so you came to ADM knowing business and knowing biochemistry, which was how you were able to rise so quickly to up the corporate structure at only 32 years old?
Well, I was vice president of another company doing joint ventures, acquisitions, and mergers for almost 7 years. Even lived in Germany for 4 years doing acquisitions and mergers. And that's how I got to know ADM. When I lived in Frankfurt, Germany, I was doing ADM's an international company, and I was doing some joint ventures with them for my previous employer, a large company, also a $30 billion company. ADM at that time was about a $70 billion company. ADM was number 56 on the Fortune 500 at that time. I think the number 48 largest company in America today.
Wow.
And I was doing joint ventures with ADM, and that's how I got to know them. I was working with another company, but by doing some projects together, that's how I got to know them, to the point where they offered a job for me to be the divisional president of their biotech division.
At that time in your life, who were you in terms of what made you tick? What did you believe in? What were you trying to achieve in life?
Well, at that time in my life, having an Ivy League PhD at age 25, the average age finishing Cornell for a PhD is about 32. I was 22 as a PhD student, so I was a very ambitious 22 as a PhD student at Cornell, graduated 25, 7 years, above head of the average age, and so very ambitious. I saw an Ivy League education was really going to lead to an opportunity for me to become the CEO of one of the largest companies in the world, and I was very focused on that. That's all I could think about. I'd say I was very power-driven, very greed-driven. I saw success as becoming a very top executive of one of the largest companies in the world. I wasn't looking at a life of significance. I did not have God in my life. I saw success defined as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and earning a lot of money. That's what I saw at that stage of my life. And I'd say most of the students around me at PhD level in Ivy League school was, it's a lot of work. It's hard to get in. You pour a lot into your life into that. And I think a lot of them, some of the ones want to go be professors, and I think that's great because they were looking more at life of significance. But the ones that were looking to go into corporate world, I think we're looking at say, wow, we're going to become multimillionaires with this education, and most of us did become multimillionaires with that education. So that mine led to a big fall, but it did get me exactly what I wanted at that point in my life.
So you were. That's great. That's a great picture. We're trying to imagine a young man full of talent, full of intellect, ambitious, gets the PhD from the Ivy League school, has his sights set on success in the business world, and then you jumped into the waters and started climbing. How did those early business years work for you, and how did they shape you?
Well, I would say at the company that I was with in New York, 2 years and 4 years in Germany, a company called Degussa, now called Evonik, a $30 billion chemical company. And I was involved more on the biotech side of that company. I'd say that, I really had mentors in my life, and I'd say that was full of integrity. I felt like I think I was looking back, starting at age 25 when I graduated from Cornell. I think I was on a very good track from a moral compass standpoint. And then I joined ADM, and I want to make it clear, ADM's got 30,000 people still working for them today. They're even larger today than then. They had 30,000 hardworking people then doing the right thing each and every day, full of integrity. There were really 4 executives at the very top, and myself being one of those 4 that were the bad apples. So I want to make it clear, ADM's a great company. Decatur, Illinois, where they're headquartered at, is a great city. It's just that they had 4 bad apples, and I was one of those that were greed focused. I would say selfish leaders instead of servant leaders is probably the best way to define me and the other executives at that point of time. So I joined ADM, and my first week, the 7 top executives got use of their 7 corporate jets. I was number 4, so I got a corporate jet, access to a Falcon 50 anytime I wanted it, and then also a couple weeks after that, I bought the CEO's home. He lived in it for 30 years. And during the time he was CEO, he wanted to move something smaller, being 75 years of age. So I bought his home. It was the home of John Daniels, the original founder of Archer Daniels Midland, 115 years earlier. So just picture in October 89, my first month working at ADM, I'm basically flying around in a corporate jet at age 32 and living in a mansion with an 8-car garage, horse riding stables where your kids ride in an inside arena, 15 acres. I mean, it was a mansion. Just imagine a mansion with an 8-car garage. I mean, at 32, if you look at it from a materialistic standpoint, I had it all. Had the 8-car garage full of 8 cars, had a Ferrari, 2 BMWs, 2 Mercedes. I mean, I was basically Justin Bieber before Justin Bieber.
It is kind of hard to imagine that kind of success at that age. When we see it with athletes or the Justin Biebers of the world, it often doesn't go well. Like, how does somebody at that age handle 8 cars full of Jaguars and Mercedes in a house of that size and a private jet? How does that sink into a 30-year-old?
I tell you, it doesn't sink in well. And when I see these rock stars and athletes and I see them fall at such a young age because of that wealth, I can relate to it because I was that guy. I mean, my base salary was $350,000 a year. You're talking 1989 in a place that's a very low cost of living, Decatur, Illinois, 3 hours south of Chicago. So $350,000 base, but with stock options and bonuses, I'm talking legal. I'm not talking about any of the frauds that were involved that we're going to talk about here a little bit later. But I'm talking about legal salary that's reported. W-2, taxes paid. It was $2 or $3 million a year every year I was there. The 7.5 years I was there, $2 or $3 million a year 30 years ago. You're talking that's $10 million today. So I'm a 32-year-old. And don't have God in my life. So I'm all about myself, the selfish leader, and making basically equivalent today at about $10 million a year.
Mm. And you're married.
Today's time.
When did you get married?
Yeah, I was married 1979. I met my wife. She was in 7th grade, and I was in 8th grade. And we met in junior high. We were in the junior high band, so this before we went to high school, and then we went to our proms together. And we've been married 40 years as of this past June, and just that alone, that our marriage survived, is a miracle of God, really, to survive what some of the things we're going to be describing during our time talking together.
Okay, so you're married, and so we've given a picture of you living your dream, pursuing success, big success in the corporate world, achieving it. I mean, really, you're riding high. What happened next, and what did you get mixed up into?
Well, what happened next is the following, and my wife is such a big part of that, and I think the movie it kind of relates to it in a very short way, but it really missed the details that the books captured. Often books are more detailed, and especially the one that came out more recently, the Against All Odds, in terms of my wife's role. But in all 3 books, my wife's role is pretty clear. The case would have never happened without my wife, Ginger. There's no doubt. She started the entire case. When you're in Decatur, Illinois, and you have 80,000 people in a city, and 30,000 work for the company. I mean, it's a company town.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it really
Wow.
is. It's a company town. Great town, great city, great company. Like I said, it was 4 bad apples, not 30,000 bad apples. And basically, she saw this. She became a Christian years before me, a decade before me. And she saw this obsession I was having with the 8-car garage and flying around on the jet and having the title divisional president. And keep in mind, I'm working for a 75-year-old and a 69-year-old, and I'm 32. So even though I'm executive number 4, it's a pretty clear path to become executive number 1 or 2.
Yeah, you're on your way.
Yeah, to be either the CEO or the COO. It was a clear path. Matter of fact, it was announced in Fortune magazine shortly before they learned that I was an informant that I was going to become the COO, replace the COO. So I would have went from the divisional president to the company president, basically, with that move. Now, once they learned that I was an informant, it changed. It obviously changed all of that. But that's the path I was on, mainly because I'm half their age.
Right.
And they're pouring into me. I mean, I'm being mentored by them to replace them in a succession planning situation. But basically, my wife saw all these changes and how I was obsessed with greed and cars and the jets and the mansion and the $30,000 horses that were on our property, and so being a town that the company was the biggest company in the town. When the FBI did things, they're usually going to be doing it for AD. When the FBI in Decatur office is doing work, they're pretty much going to be doing it for ADM. I mean, actually helping ADM, with theft from the plants and that are going to cross state lines. When theft goes across state lines, it's a federal matter. And a lot of these products, are going across state lines, obviously. They go all around the country. Matter of fact, ADM's got hundreds of plants all around the world, Asia, Europe, and so on. That's how I met them when I was in Frankfurt, Germany. So basically, the FBI was doing work for ADM, actually helping ADM, and it was amazing. They're helping solve $100,000 crimes or a $1 million crime, and then right under their nose is a crime that's hundreds of millions of dollars, that ADM was doing actually against the government. So they're helping solve these little things to help ADM, but in reality, there was this price-fixing scheme, this international cartel, that was hundreds of millions of dollars theft every year for well over a decade that was ongoing right under their noses. So I shared that with my wife. I was 3 years there. The company trusted me. They saw me part of the family. So now they felt like, hey, let's bring Mark into this. Now the CEO's 78 years old. Now the president's 72. It's 3 years later after I joined. And they started bringing me into this cartel because they have to. They're both heading towards 80 years old. So they start bringing me into this cartel that they have with the ingredients, working with our competitors to fix the prices of our ingredients, which really overinflates the prices of ingredients, which then makes the food that your audience is buying, Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Kraft or Kellogg's, it makes that price of that food higher because ingredient prices are higher. So, the consumers are paying higher prices when price fixing is occurring. And I shared that with my wife, and I tell you, my wife, having the right moral compass, and she's driving a 10-year-old Wrangler when I'm driving a $250,000 Ferrari. So the cars didn't mean anything to her. She grew up on a beef cattle farm and in the country, so none of this materialism and planes really didn't mean anything to her.
Wow.
And she said, Mark, you're really becoming an addict. We had this conversation on November 5th, 1992. She said, you're an addict with your work, not with drugs or alcohol, but you're addicted to your work. All you do is work from the minute you get up in the morning to the minute you go to bed. And our 3 children, she said, don't even know their father. And which is true. There's no doubt. I 90% of my income is based on bonuses and stock options. So the more I performed, they were performance parameters. So the higher I performed, the higher I could make my income. 90% of it was based on performance. So that really drove me to get the highest amount of stock options or bonuses that I could get, which most people in corporate America would work like that, basically, at that level, especially in that period of time. So this would have been 1992 to give a picture of that period of time. So I share with her about how they're mentoring me for 7 months now to take over and get involved with this cartel where we meet with our competitors. And so she started asking questions. She said, Mark, is that legal? I said, it's not legal, but everybody does it. In the commodity business, they told me you can't survive without doing this. And then she said, well, who pays for this extra hundreds of millions, in some cases $1 billion a year, that the company earns extra from the price fixing scheme? And I said, well, basically consumers pay that. They buy $50 of groceries. They may pay an extra $3, $4, $5 extra for the ingredients being price fixed in those foods that they're buying each time they go to the store. And then I never forget, she said, you mean my grandma who's on $200 a week Social Security is paying for this? And we live in a mansion with an 8-car garage. And then she said the thing I was hoping never to hear. She said she was going to go back in her study and pray about it, and we'd talk about it later. And when she did that, I knew I was in trouble. And she went back and prayed about it for a couple hours, and she came back and she said, Mark, I made a decision. God led me to a decision. You're involved with something for 7 years or for 7 months that's been going on for over 12 years. You've only been at the company 3 years. So it started a decade before you even joined the company. She said, if you're involved 7 months, what a perfect time to turn yourself into the federal authorities, she said. So I said, Ginger, I can't imagine. I said, I could go to prison for price fixing. That's breaking antitrust laws. I said, the CEO is a billionaire. He's good friends with President Clinton. He went to President Clinton's funeral and President Nixon's funeral and President Clinton's plane. He picks up the phone and talks to U.S. presidents. I said, they would come after us with everything they have. I'm more afraid of them than I would be the government than going to prison. And she said, no, Mark. She said, she said, I'll never forget, she said, my CEO is bigger than your CEO. Her CEO is God. And she said, God will protect us, but we're going to do this. And if you don't do this today, I'm going to do it for you, because you either turn yourself in or I'm turning you in.
Wow.
And that discussion happened over a couple hours. I said, Ginger, we could end up homeless. And she said she'd rather be homeless than live in a house with illegal activity. So that, it is so clear. In the book, even The Informant, is so clear what happened at my wife's role. The movie kind of portrayed a little bit of that, her role, but not as strong as it was. But basically, that case would have never happened if it wasn't for my wife, Ginger. And I've known her since she was in 7th grade, and I knew she met it. And if I didn't turn myself in that day, and we did it together, the two of us together, her with me, that case would have never happened.
Wow.
Biggest price fixing case in U.S. history, by the way.
Wow. So
started by a stay-at-home mom raising 3 young kids.
I'm definitely interviewing the wrong Whitacre. I can sense that already.
Absolutely.
Ginger is the star of this story.
She's really the whistleblower.
Yeah.
She really is. I'm really the informant, and there's a big difference between a whistleblower and an informant. She's really the whistleblower of this case.
Right. Oh my goodness, and a woman of God, obviously, because she was living. That's fantastic. But now take me into your. I mean, there's been times when our wives have told us to do something that was correct, and we've done that, but done it grudgingly. What was your attitude like when you went into that process?
Well, I did. For one, I knew it was the right thing. I knew what she was speaking to me was the right thing to do. I really did. And I felt almost relieved to share. I'm involved with 7 months with something that's a federal crime. And we're already this large, number 56 on the Fortune 500 successful company. We really didn't have to cheat. We were debt-free as a company, $70 billion in revenue.
Right.
It just shows me, looking back, that, boy, when you're greedy, it's never enough.
Right.
Because we were already successful executives. We were already a successful company. But in my position, I either had to follow that line or I wouldn't be moving up the corporate ladder from the role I was in. So I either had to quit or do it.
Wow.
Because I wasn't going to get promoted if I fought that when they've been doing it for 12 years. So, I mean, that's the only decision I had, and I wasn't willing to quit and leave all of that, the mansion, the jet, and being in my early 30s. I just wasn't willing to quit and walk away. So instead I sold my soul, and I knew I would move up the corporate ladder if I would do what they did and learn from them. So instead I went the wrong path because of greed.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I tried to talk Ginger out of it for a couple hours, I could see she wasn't going to budge. And so we were talking to the FBI, and we're talking to them 4 hours that day. We knew the FBI, like I said, they did cases for ADM. I mean, to help ADM on a lot smaller cases when this lot larger case against the society was actually happening right under their noses. And so when we're sharing with the FBI, I'll never forget how stern Ginger was, and just, Mark, you're going to do this, and you're going to lay this out, and I'm going to make sure you do. I'm not going to leave here until I know you really tell them everything that I shared with her. And so we're sharing that, and basically, I mean, I had two choices that day. Once you share, you're involved with a crime that's hundreds of millions of dollars every year of theft from your own consumers. I basically had a choice to either get arrested or start wearing a wire the next day to go after kind of the kingpins of the case that are teaching me how to do this the past 7 months, the actual price fixing, the cartel members, and that's the choice I had. And I chose, I wasn't willing to be arrested, so I chose being an informant. Ginger talked to them thinking, well, can't you go tap phones? Can't you go do what you do? When she was originally turning me in, she didn't realize that I would have to do the work. She thought they would go tap phones and stuff and do the work. She didn't realize that the evidence gathering had to come from me because I was the insider. So the only one that could, in those ranks that could get that information was me wearing a wire.
Wow. When you start to paint this picture for us, Mark, and when I do think back to the movie The Informant, which was comedic and we're all kind of laughing, this was not a funny matter for you guys at all, was it? This was no laughing matter.
No, it wasn't a funny matter for us, or FBI, nor ADM. There wasn't a funny matter to no one. I mean, that's why the 3 books are very serious dramas.
My goodness.
Very similar to Tom Cruise in The Firm in terms of what my wife said when we saw The Informant. Warner Brothers flew us out 6 months early, and we got to meet all the actors and got to see the movie as a family 6 months before it hit the hit the public, at the cinemas. And, we walked out and my wife said, this movie's not even our life. The Firm was the life that we lived, and so we couldn't even relate to it.
So, Mark, let me interrupt. You agreed to wear a wire, and at the time, you had no idea that this was going to be such a long process. Is that right?
I was told in the beginning, I was told that the average amount of time that an informant wears a wire is about 6 weeks. So they said this is probably going to be about a 6-week process. Once I started wearing a wire every day, Monday through Friday during my work hours, they then saw that it's much more complicated. There's a lot more products involved than they thought. The crime's a lot bigger than they thought it was. And it ended up where I wore a wire every day for 3 years because of that.
Wow.
It was not a 6-week process. And the stress was so large, as I mentioned to you earlier, there was so much stress. They don't allow an informant to wear a wire longer than a year now. The FBI doesn't, because they saw what happens when someone wears one for 3.
Tell me about the stress.
All the stress is unbelievable. When they're wiring you up, they're saying, Mark, these are hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars involved, billionaires. And I mean, everyone was either a multimillionaire or in a couple cases, billionaires that are part of this cartel. And they said, Mark, if these guys catch you, they're going to kill you. And I heard that every week. It was more stress. It was more stress than anything I've ever done in my life. I had my incarceration was less stressful than wearing a wire.
I would imagine our listeners, about 0.00001% of us have ever been in that situation. But you were in it for three years.
That's correct.
What did it do to you?
Oh, I couldn't. Eventually, I lost 60 pounds wearing a wire, and I started losing hair. I couldn't sleep at night. On the documentary, they show they have actors reenact on the documentary that's on markwhitacre.com, the Discovery Channel documentary with the real agents as part of that. They have actors reenact where I'm blowing driveways off with a gas leak blower at 3 a.m. during thunderstorms, and then meeting the FBI at 6. I mean, and I still have my shirt and tie and mics taped to my chest, blowing the driveway off at 3 a.m. I mean, I couldn't sleep at night, and all I kept thinking about, these guys are going to kill me when they find out that I'm going to be testifying against them. That's all I kept thinking about.
How do you act normal the movie makes it comedic. The movie makes it look like you're stumbling, bumbling, doing silly things. But in the real world, that person would not, the movie, the actor or I'd say the role that Matt Damon was playing in the movie would not been the number 4 executive of the 56th largest company in the world for 8 years, that role, divisional president, if you were really that person. You know what I mean? Yeah.
And even the agents, they made them look like Keystone Cops and the other ADM executives. They made everybody kind of look much more sillier than reality. You wouldn't be the number 4 executive of one of the largest companies in the world if you were really that person that Matt Damon was playing.
As a movie maker here, that I would love to explore with Soderbergh and those guys why they made that call, what they thought that would do for the audiences. Had they made this movie, like you said, with the tone of Grisham's The Firm or a serious corporate espionage movie, would it have done better? Would it have done worse? I mean, I guess we'll never know for sure.
It didn't do well. It was only about $40 million at the box office, which is one of the lowest for a Matt Damon movie. He'd be 10 times that for his Bourne movies. And it would have been more like Bourne movies if they would have done it like the books, a serious drama.
Yeah,
I believe.
Agree.
But he told us at the premiere, we were at the premiere and walked the red carpet with Soderbergh and Matt Damon and his wife, and Ginger and I walked with them. And he told us at the premiere, Soderbergh did, the reason why he decided it, he said there was a movie called The Insider with Russell Crowe playing Jeffrey Wigand, the whistleblower against a big tobacco company, Brown and Williamson. And he said because our story was so similar to that, he thought if he made the true drama out of it, it would have looked like he just redid The Insider, and he didn't want to just do a redo of someone else's movie. So he asked the writer of the movie, Scott Burns. He said, "Turn this one into a comedy where I'm never compared to The Insider."
That is interesting.
He said that was his reason behind it.
Well, in real life, like we said at the beginning, it was no comedy. You are not sleeping. You're losing hair. You're losing weight. Every day you're walking in. And you have to obviously appear to be the normal Mark to all the... You can't give away that you're acting different. How did you do that?
It was hard. I mean, you get better at it the longer you do it. It was very difficult in the beginning. I think some people were asking me, did I have cancer? Just my appearance was changing. So there were some friends of mine that were in the company that were concerned and said, "Mark, you need to see a doctor. I think you may have cancer or heart disease or something." The way you're in reality, it was just stress. But people were concerned.
So the story unfolds, the investigation takes place, and what happens to you?
Well, what happens, after wearing a wire for a couple months, the FBI was so appreciative they went to the U.S. Attorney in Chicago and said, "Here's a guy that would be killed if they catch him. He's wearing a wire 8, 9, 10 hours a day. And this is only after wearing a wire 2 or 3 months, well before 3 years. The evidence was overwhelming. They could see it was going to be the largest antitrust price fixing case in history, even as within 2 or 3 months. And they told the U.S. attorney, we need to give Mark full immunity. We need to reward him. So they came back to me with a full immunity agreement signed by the U.S. attorney, the lead prosecutor in Chicago. So basically, even though I was involved with it for 7 months before Ginger forced me to tell the FBI, I was not going to be charged at all in the case. Now, after wearing a wire for a couple years, and the stress of doing that and not thinking clearly, obviously, blowing driveways off at 3 a.m. during thunderstorms, like the documentary, shows clearly what happened in terms of how I was falling. The longer I wore a wire, the more I was falling apart. Mm-hmm. When I knew I was going to be let go and fired, once they learned I was the informant, this is after wearing a wire for a couple of years, and I knew the case was going to be coming to an end in less than a year. At that point, I saw all the stock options that I was going to be leaving on the table, and I'm thinking, here I am, the number 4 executive for 7 years. All this is going to be a loss. How am I going to keep this big home and standard of living that I have with the living that I'm currently earning? $2 or $3 million a year every year, and a lot of that based on stock options. I had a 5-year set of stock options that I was going to be fired about a year or two. The case was going to go public about a year or two before I could exercise that. And at that point, those were worth about $9 million. And I thought, well, here's $9 million owed to me. I'm not even going to be paid because I'm not going to be there the date that I can exercise those stock options. If they say 3 years on them or 5 years on them, this particular case was 5 years, that means you can't exercise them for 5 years. Well, that 5-year date was going to be a date after they already know I'm the informant. When I'm no longer, they're going to kick me out. I knew that, and they did kick me out the day they learned that I'm the witness against them. So I went in and thought, well, here, they're stealing $1 billion a year for 12 years in a row. If the accountants tell on me that I'm exercising my stock options early, they couldn't do anything about it. What could they do about a $9 million crime when they're stealing $1 billion a year for over a decade? So I knew they couldn't tell on me because the 3 guys above me are involved with a bigger crime. So I basically wrote 5 checks equated to what those stock options would be, and I wrote those to myself. I basically stole my own stock options 2 years early and wrote my own severance package. And I thought if it ever did go to a jury, I thought it wouldn't, but if it ever did, well, they would see that I have these stock options. This would have been owed to me, so they would understand why I did what I did. And so I did write 5 checks for $9 million, and I was charged the day that ADM learned that I was the informant, that I was the one that exposed the case and was wearing a wire for those 3 years. That very day, because they knew about the money all along, but that very day they called the FBI and said, he's no white knight informant. He stole $9 million from us the same time he's working for the FBI. So I ended up going to prison for the $9 million fraud, and they went to prison for price fixing.
I have no right to ask this question, and you either don't have to answer it or we'll actually edit it off the tape if you want. But my real question is, did your wife know about that? No,
she did not. And I purposely didn't tell her that. She turned me in for price fixing. I thought, well, she's going to turn me in for that if I shared that. But I really thought, and plus you're not thinking clearly when you're wearing a wire for a couple of years. And I was wearing a wire a couple of years already before I made that decision about the $9 million. But I really thought at that time, thinking is, when my thinking was blurred, I really thought that would be a good defense because I really had paperwork that supports that they owed me millions of dollars, in the stock options. But the challenge is that I did it. I did it. The challenge is I did it a year before you could exercise it.
And that landed you in prison, right?
That did. Yes, that did.
So tell me about how that went down.
Well, I want to first off say that when the FBI called the ADM and said, look, this guy's no white knight informant. He stole $9 million from us. He wrote 5 checks to himself at the same time he's working for the FBI. The FBI immediately came to my home, sat with Ginger and I and said, Mark, explain this $9 million. I pull out the stock options and show what I would have been owed and and all that. And they understood. So they were sympathetic, but they said, stock options have an exercise date for a reason. That means you can exercise them the date that's on that stock option. If it says 5 years, you have to wait 5 years. You can't exercise them in 3.5. But they were so sympathetic. They said, Mark, Ginger's been begging us to hospitalize you. But she's been telling us and informing us you're blowing the driveway off with a gas leak blower at 3 a.m. during thunderstorms. It'd be raining, I'd be blowing the driveway off. She said you've been falling apart, and she's been begging us to hospitalize you. And we didn't want to hospitalize you because we knew a doctor would say, this guy can't wear a wire any longer. And they needed the evidence. So they said, we sacrificed your own mental health well-being to get the evidence that we needed. And for that, you made some poor decisions under a lot of stress that you wouldn't have made most likely if you weren't under that stress. So for that reason, we're going to get you the best plea agreement we can get you. It won't be immunity anymore, but we're going to get you a very reasonable and the best plea agreement we can get you for this $9 million fraud that you did, that we think you were not in your right mind when you did it.
Okay.
And they got me a 6-month plea agreement, a Martha Stewart sentence.
All right.
6 months in a federal prison with no fence, a white-collar camp. Deal of a lifetime. My attorney calls me in Chicago and says, Mark, this is a deal of a lifetime. 6 months in a white-collar camp. And looked at the lawyer and said, boy, 6 months seems like a long time after all I risked for the FBI. And he said, Mark, ADM's going to go to the newspaper about this $9 million. The FBI have to punish you some. The prosecutors do. They can't just give you full immunity for a $9 million crime. But this is the minimum amount of punishment. This is a deal of a lifetime, Mark. Sign this. And Ginger looked at me as we're sitting in my lawyer's office in Chicago, and she said, Mark, sign this. Let's put it behind us. And I looked at Ginger, again, not with a clear mind. This is after a guy wore a wire. This is a couple months after wearing a wire for 3 years every day. And I looked at Ginger and said, Ginger, you're the one that got me in this mess in the first place. I'm going to do the opposite you want me to do. And I ripped that plea agreement, that 6-month plea agreement, up in front of her. And I fired that lawyer and went out and hired all new lawyers the next day and fought the case for 3 years to get a 10-year sentence instead.
Wow.
Went out of 6 months. So even with the $9 million, the FBI did everything they could. They were very sympathetic and knew that I had stock options, that I felt that they owed me that ADM owed me that I was going to get fired before I could exercise them, only because I'm an informant, by working for the FBI. So they knew my logic behind it, and they saw the logic behind that decision. But they also knew the stress would be the only thing that really would make you make that decision to write 5 checks to yourself. And for that reason, they wanted to give me the best plea agreement they could get, especially with Ginger begging them to hospitalize me that last year and a half that I was working for the FBI.
It reminds me of pleading with God and saying, I know that you abhor sin, but I have all these good reasons for being sinful. I have all these justifications for being sinful. I mean, that's kind of the way human nature can easily slide, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I didn't have God. I was greedy, and I wanted to keep that same standard of living that I had for those 7 years, making $2 or $3 million a year. I thought, well, who's going to hire somebody that wore a wire against their own company? It's easier to get a job as a felon than it is a whistleblower.
Yeah,
so
for
I
sure.
thought, who's going to hire me? I'm only at that point in my mid-30s, and I thought, well, my severance is stock options that was going to be owed to me anyway, that I've earned. I'm just taking what was earned. That was my thinking.
So they took away from you everything, your freedom, your life, and you walked into a prison for a 10-year sentence.
I did, and there's no parole, just for your listeners to know, there's no parole in the federal system. That what they hear parole, that's state sentences. But in federal prison, there's no parole, and you get 15% off for good behavior, so you have to do 8.5 years on a 10-year sentence.
Wow.
And that's exactly what I did.
That's what you did. 8.5 years.
8.5 years on a 10-year sentence. Yeah, that's correct.
In a federal
From
prison.
age 41 to 49.
Age 41 to 49. What happened during those 8.5 years to you?
Well, this is where the movie, they even filmed this, but they took it out by being a comedy. because it wouldn't fit the comedy. But they actually filmed a scene doing this, a very serious scene. It's a shame because it would have really shown the seriousness of the story. But when I knew then that I ripped up this 6-month plea agreement only to get 8.5 years instead, and all because I said it's Ginger's fault that I'm in that mess anyway for her turning me in or forcing me to turn myself in. For that reason, I tried to take my own life. I thought, I'm not going to have a family when I get out 8.5 years later. Who's going to hire me coming out at age 49, even with an Ivy League PhD and convicted felon, 8.5 years in prison? Who's going to hire me? So I tried to take my own life. I tried to kill myself. And I was hospitalized for a month. I was treated for post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, some of the things that happen when you wear a wire for 3 years every day for 10 hours.
Mm-hmm.
The stresses of that. So I was treated for that, heavily medicated at that time, sent home after about a month, had 7 months before I had to go to federal prison to kind of get my house in order. And there's a guy that was reading all about this in the newspaper, a CFO of a large biotech company. He was reading this, and somebody I didn't know, and he was reading this, and a month after I sent home for suicide attempt, and all I thought about is, well, before I go to prison, I'm going to make this suicide work, is what I was thinking at that time. I'm not going to have an attempt. I'm going to actually kill myself. I'm not going to go to prison for 9 years. And he showed up on my porch. Ginger told me somebody's at the door. I went and talked to him. His name was Ian Howes, CFO of a biotech company, also part of a group called CBMC Christian Businessmen Connection, which I never heard of at this point. This would have been September 1997, 23 years ago. And I'll never forget when he said, Mark, prison's going to be the beginning of your life, and you're going to find your true purpose in your life with the journey you're ready to start. I remember running to the kitchen. I said, Ginger, there's somebody on the porch that's crazier than I am. He thinks this is going to be the beginning of my life, and I'm going to find my purpose in my life with this journey that I'm ready to start. I'm about ready to go to prison for 8.5 years. And she fell to her knees in tears, and she said, thank God. God sent somebody. I've been praying for 10 years, Mark, for you. And your parents have been praying for decades for you. And I pray you go out and listen to this man because you have not listened to your own family. And God sent this man, and I want you to listen to him. And I went out and asked Ian, I said, Ian, what do you have in mind? He said he had a study called Operation Timothy. And I said, Ian, I've been going to church. My parents forced me to go to church as a youngster. I've been going to church with Ginger and my kids. I'm already a Christian. I go to church. And he said, Mark, I'm not talking about going to church. I'm talking about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And he said, I want to introduce you to him. And he had a study that CBMC uses, Christian Businessmen Connection used, called Operation Timothy. And he said, I'm going to take you through that. It's usually about an hour a week, but you're leaving. He said, it's usually an hour a week for a year and a half. But he said, in 7 months, you're leaving for a decade. He said, I would spend 6, 7, 8 hours a week with you and introduce you to Jesus. And he did. And he started meeting with me and going through Operation Timothy, and which is really a Bible study, introducing. And you have the Bible right by its side. So you're going through Scripture and Book of John, and you're learning about Jesus and Jesus dying for my sins. And I wanted to believe it. And it started giving me hope. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to kill myself, but I wasn't there yet. And then I go to prison. And shortly after I entered prison, another man showed up. His name was Chuck Colson.
Huh.
And Chuck Colson was the White House counsel, you probably know, for President Nixon back in the 70s.
Yeah.
He had an office right next to the Oval Office, and he was in his 30s. And he went to prison by the time he was 40 because of the Watergate scandal. And the director of the FBI went, the Attorney General went, about 12 people that worked for President Nixon went to prison. President Nixon would have went to prison, but President Ford pardoned him instead. Mm-hmm. But Chuck Colson and the others were not pardoned. Chuck Colson went to prison. He became a Christian through that journey. And Chuck Colson showed up. He read about me in the newspaper in the Washington Post. Same way Ian Howes was reading about me in the newspapers. It was a very high-profile case. I'm only a couple weeks in prison. And Chuck started telling me about God and about Jesus and how him going to prison was the best thing that ever happened in his life. When he went to prison 20 years earlier, this would have been 1998. He was in prison in 1976. 22 years earlier. And I said, well, that's the same thing Ian Howes has been telling me for 7 months. And he said, Mark, have you surrendered your life to Jesus yet? And I said, Chuck, I want to, and I want to believe, and it's giving me some hope. But I said, my science background, I went 8 years of college as a scientist, and I even had scientists that say, if you believe in God, you can't be a PhD scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had these scientists. One of them was a Nobel Prize winner in physics at Cornell. And I look at my parents who didn't go to college at all that were telling me about God and about Jesus for years and for decades. And here's these scientists I had for 8 years, one of them a Nobel Prize winner, that said, you can't be a scientist if you believe in God. I said, I have 8 years of education. That's a block for me. And he started sending me book after book and article after article about scientists that believed in God, because I thought there was no scientists that believed in God. And the first one was Albert Einstein, an article that only God could create man in the universe. The Big Bang Theory was impossible. And I thought, well, Albert Einstein's a pretty smart guy, I thought. And they start other books and other articles. And I tell you, after reading that for about 3 months of all these books and articles, I'll never forget that I got down on my knees on June 4th, 1998. Now, think about this. 7.5 years earning $2 or $3 million a year, living in a mansion and having a jet. Now I'm 8.5 years in a 10 by 10, a concrete floor, a locker, and a roommate at $20 a month for 8.5 years. On my third month in prison, I got down on my knees after I saw that, no doubt about it, the science supports that God does exist. I got down on my knees and surrendered my life to Jesus on June 4th, 98. And the peace that I had after that is amazing, that I realized, looking back, I became a free man in prison. It took me going to prison to become a free man. And my life changed dramatically. Chuck Colson kept meeting with me and writing me. I mean, I was hearing from Chuck, getting letters from him every month. He'd meet with me monthly. For 8.5 years, he was like a father to me, and poured into my life to help me nurture and water that seed that was planted, and to nurture my faith where I could grow in my faith. And I remember in August of 98, 2 months as a Christian, I said, God, Chuck Colson and Ian Howe said I would find my purpose in my life. I got 8 more years of prison yet to go, Father. And it's August of 98. I'm only 5-6 months in prison towards the 8.5-year sentence. I said, what can be my purpose in life in prison? And I looked at that Bible that Chuck Colson gave me. I looked at those Operation Timothy books, which a Bible study that Ian Howes went through with me. And I thought, where in the world are people more helpless and hopeless than federal prison? And I started taking guys through Operation Timothy in prison for 8.5 years. The most productive years of my life, I'm telling you, emphatically, without a doubt, the most productive years of my entire 62 years of life was 8.5 years in federal prison at $20 a month.
You are listening to Mark Whitacre, and this is the No Shame Podcast. And if you've been with us from the beginning, you've heard an incredible testimony of how the kingdom of God works in our lives, but it is threatened by the kingdom of the flesh. Mark, you have shared with us so many things that show where the flesh leads us. In some cases, the world of science says you can't be a scientist and be a believer in God. Well, Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein would disagree. The world says you have to pursue and climb no matter what. But God says, live a simple life of quiet dignity. Serve your neighbors. Live with the scales honestly balanced. You know, that crime at the heart of this is addressed in Psalms and in Proverbs. Don't have unbalanced scales. Treat people fairly. You have learned and you have just testified to us that when we are weakest, we can be the strongest. You were never weaker than when you were in federal prison, and you just told me those were the most productive years of an otherwise worldly, very productive life. There is something in this story, I hope, for all of us. Maybe our calling is to go out and reach out to our friend who's just been sentenced to jail, and we're just going to write them off. Maybe it's time for us to go knock on their door. Maybe it's time for us to listen to the voice of our wives or the voice of the Spirit or our husbands saying, I think you need to do the right thing in whatever situation you face. It seems like, Mark, in the long run, and we should wrap it up, and I should let you get into your day, but what would you say the most significant thing that God has taught you through this journey that you would share with our listeners might be?
Well, and I want to just something I need to say that God blessed me so much in prison. We had millions of dollars in legal fees, $9 million we had to pay back on the fines, or I would have had 5-year longer sentence if I didn't do that. And the companies we stole from in the price-fixing scheme won hundreds of millions of dollars back from class action suits. Coca-Cola alone won $400 million back. My wife was about ready to move back in home with our 3 kids with her mom because left her almost destitute. And those companies came together that won these hundreds of million dollars from ADM, hundreds of millions, and they contacted my wife and said, we're going to take care of your family financially while your husband's in prison. My wife went back to be a teacher. She became Teacher of the Year in 2007, went back to college at age 40. They put my kids through college. The companies I stole from took care of my family for 8.5 years financially as a whistleblower reward to my wife. A miracle of God. Our marriage divorce rate, if you serve 5 years and longer, is 99% divorce rate. We're married 40 years as of this past June, with a 99% divorce rate if you serve 5 years and longer. I served 8.5 years, and we're married 40 years, a miracle of God. I was employed the day I got back out in the biotech industry. Cornell started bringing executives into prison to meet me, CEOs of company. I joined a company with a Christian CEO. I became the COO of that company, of a cancer research company. God blessed us even through all that term. I've been out 13 years now, and I will tell you that God walked us through a very dark journey and put us and took our life from ashes to beauty, to the point where my wife did an interview when the movie came out in 2009, and CBS News asked her, they said, Ginger, how'd you do it with a 99% divorce rate? And she said, God told me to stay with him even when I didn't want to. God told me to love him unconditionally. And she said she's glad she stuck through it. And then they asked her, she said divorce was never an option, but she said murder was. And she considered it twice. And they asked her when she wanted to murder me, and she said it was when I took a 6-month plea agreement and threw it in the trash can. She said she wanted to kill me, right on national TV. And they said, well, what would have happened if he signed that 6-month plea agreement? And Ginger said, I was so upset that he didn't, but looking back, I think he would have came out the same greedy man he went in. I don't think he would even listen to Ian Howes or Chuck Colson. She said, I thank God that God gave him 8.5 years in prison. It's exactly what he needed. The 6 months would have not been enough. And I look back, the 6 months would not have been enough. I needed to have all those distractions out of the way. I needed to be broken. But for your listeners, the thing I want to emphasize is God, without God, you can't. God will walk you through life, and God will take any life through ashes to beauty. And when you're going through adversity, God will make you look at it differently, because he will walk you through it. You will grow from it. You will learn from it, and you'll come out molded and better than you were than when you went through adversity. The most important decision I've ever made was having God in my life, by far. And I thank God for what happened, and then I went to federal prison, because I don't believe I'd ever know him today if it wasn't for that brokenness.
May these words sink into us, and might we live for the kingdom of God, which is upside down from the kingdom of this world in so many ways. You've been listening to Mark Whitacre, and you can see the documentary, read more, read the books, markwhitacre.com, and it's Whitacre is spelled Whitacre. Mark, thank you so much for being the guest on our podcast this morning. This is truly fascinating life you've lived, but more than that, you are a true soldier for the kingdom. And thank you for sharing your testimony, your story, and being willing to go. I know you speak a lot at mayoral prayer breakfast, and I know you have turned this story into a way to build the kingdom of God. Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Thank you for having me. It's been a blessing to be part of the show.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame of the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid.
No Shame is a weekly podcast where John Groders discusses life at the intersection of faith and culture with all kinds of interesting and inspiring guests. Subscribe to the podcast today by going to johngroders.com, select the podcast tab, and hit subscribe. Listen whenever you have time, but don't miss any of these life-giving conversations.